For this week's Watercolor Wednesday, I wanted to explore creating some thumbnail landscapes. I often get very impatient with myself when I like to keep working, and a lot of time with watercolor, you have to wait and let layers dry. So working in thumbnails allows me to work on several mini paintings at a time, and I can kind of jump back and forth as I need to let areas dry while I work on other parts of other paintings. So on my watercolor paper, I'm loosely drawing in 5 rectangles. I've got a couple different landscapes in mind that I've located reference images on the website Unsplash, which is my go-to site for reference images for pretty much all things. It's a really fabulous site if you haven't checked it out. And almost all the images are royalty free. So I've got some reference images up on my computer. I've sketched out my rectangles and I'm wetting my paints with my spray brush. And now I'm just loosely drawing in the landscape details. I'm not getting very detailed or specific. I'm just adding in a gist of what each reference image has so that I can get right to the watercolor. So in the first one, I'm working on it's a sunset reflected on the water with some purple and pinky flowers and a path that leads to the water in the center of the page. And then there's some mountains in the background, like between the sky and the water. So I'm very loosely wet on wet style, mapping in my colors for my sky, not really being too precious about replicating that reference image exactly, but I am trying to focus on the colors. I'm trying to use the watercolors I have to build up those rich, beautiful values in bright, bold colors that I'm seeing in my reference image. It's a lot of back and forth. Kind of waiting as things bleed into other things, letting the darker colors set. And in all honesty, I wasn't terribly patient. Even though I was working on 5 paintings at once, I rushed through some parts of this. So you'll see areas along the way where it gets very muddled, but I just kept moving around and I just kept moving on and then circling back. And in the end, I love how this page turned out. And I'm super excited to do more thumbnail watercolors. But this painting video definitely demonstrates many of the awkward stages that we go through in the art making process, especially with a medium like watercolor. So here it's putting in color, taking out color. So I'm starting to lay in the values. And then I jump to the water, which is mirroring the sky, because it's relatively calm water. So I'm doing the whole reflection of the color there, mapping in the pathway that leads from the bottom of the frame up toward the water. This is where it gets interesting because I don't really wait for the sky or the water to dry, but I'm really antsy and I want to start mapping in the land that's on the horizon line. So I go in with my purple first. It's a very dark land mass, but I really want to build up some dark colors that will eventually be a rich darkness back there without going straight in with black. So I go with purple because it's one of the darkest colors I have for this piece, and it goes well with the sky and the water. And then I'm jumping back down to kind of soften up some of the painting that I've done on the pathway. The perspective for that part of this piece doesn't really work all that well in the end, but this was just for fun and to kind of play around with some different watercolor techniques and landscapes, which I don't do very often, and just challenge myself as a watercolorist and an artist to see what I can get to work out here. There's orange in the sky and orange in the water, which is a little crazy. This is where the muddling starts to happen. But you just kind of have to trust the process and know that little by little, with some patience and some continual working, that you can get all of this to resolve in a really beautiful way. And now that my mountains in the back are fairly set, I'm going to go in with an ultramarine blue to keep working towards that super darkness in the back. I did also decide to pop in some of the yellow and orange that is in the sky and the water. This is probably a poor choice, but in my head, I was trying to kind of build it up with the colors that are already in the piece near it. It gets super, it bleeds out into the sky because the sky is re-wet and it just becomes a mess. But hang on, it's going to circle back. So then I go down to the plants that are on the bottom. It's this really beautiful scene of, lush green flowering bushes. So I lay in a couple different colors of green, a warm green and a cool green, which is my ultimate go-to when I'm doing greenery. I love having both warms and cools of that color playing off each other. And then keeping it very loose, I start to put in some of the flower texture. There's a lot of little buds of something. It's a really beautiful photograph. So I'm popping in some purples, I'm popping in some magentas and rose, and just kind of giving the illusion of what's happening there. Letting the flower color bleed into the greenery, knowing that in the end it's all going to work itself out. For this next section, I wanted to use masking fluid because there's stars in the sky. It's after sunset, overlooking like some mountains and this beautiful, spacey sky. So I'm going ahead and using Frisket masking fluid with the fine liner applicator to drop in just some very loose, indications of stars and kind of within the Milky Way situation. And then I'm gonna, because that doesn't go all the way down to the land in this piece, I'm gonna go ahead and pop in the darkness because it's almost a silhouetted landscape at the bottom. I'm gonna go ahead and paint that in black and start to get that going so that that can be dry by the time I come back in and do the late sunset colors above it. That time I did decide to go in with black, which I don't know, there's so much other color in that painting, and there was a lot of black in that landscape, so it made sense. The next square over is another kind of beautiful sky, sunrise, more so situation, looking over some land. So I'm just kind of mapping in the very, very light value for that one. And then the square on the rectangle on the bottom far right is another sky and water situation, but this time it's a blue sky, blue water, and then there's some islands or like peninsulas with a bridge, sort of kind of, that meet kind of in the middle, and then there's some grass on the foreground shore. So right now I'm painting in the water, just getting the basics of that value system locked in, and then I'm popping up to the sky. The sky has some, it almost looks like maybe there's like a fire somewhere that's kind of putting smoke up there, or else it's just rain clouds. Who knows? So I go ahead and put that in the sky and then mirror that down into the water a little bit and then kind of soften that out into the sky. It's a pretty grayish day in this painting, even though the water is so blue. And then gently putting in a little blue up there, just trying to really match the colors that I see in the reference image as best I can. And then I'm going to jump back to the middle one. This one has a bunch of different layers of landscape happening. This ended up being, I think, one of my least favorites because it was one of those situations where recreating what you see in the reference image in watercolor didn't quite add up to the same sort of image. where you needed to kind of take some artistic license to get the watercolor to read the way the photo did. But this page is all experimentation and gaining some growth as a landscape painter with this medium. So I still had a lot of fun working on it and kind of mapping in the sky and playing with the details. So just continuing to build up those layers, pop in brighter colors, and get as close to the reference colors as I can. Now I'm going into the other sections of the land, mapping in those values. I really wanted to work subtly here and just build them up very, very gradually. And then there's a little bit where there's some clouds that kind of go from the land up to the sky, so I popped that in there. And then just continuing to increase the intensity of the color and value, really starting to try to get some of the texture of these mountains in there also to define it a little bit more. Then after adding the darkest layer to the middle landscape, I popped back over to the right side one to start putting in the warm tones for the different land masses. Like I said, there's two kind of islandish things that are at the center of the page, and there's some fine details on them. So right now I'm just mapping in the colors, the values, and kind of defining the land versus the water using the colors that I see in the reference image. And then I'm going to gradually add more and more and more specific detail into this image. And in the end, it becomes one of my favorites. And I had a lot of fun working on it. But right now, it's just a bunch of blobs. But it's going to get there. I promise. But in the meantime, my masking fluid has dried on my far left image. So I'm going to go ahead and start mapping in that celestial sky, building it up from where the sun has gone below the horizon line at the bottom up toward this spacey galaxy type image that the photographer captured. So very, very subtly going from oranges to pinks up to a brighter, bolder magenta. The colors in this image are just amazing. So I really, really wanted to recreate them as best I could and give the same feel in my painting that I got from the photograph. I do find that it works better to go from light to dark, especially in a medium like watercolor, because I can always go more intense with the color and the value, but it is tricky to pull it back. So that's how I approached this guy. I just kind of got the layers of the color built in there and then popped in more color as needed to really achieve the look that I was going for. And then it's always really great when you pop in like something like that bright bold blue at the top, and then I wash my brush off and dry it off a bit and then kind of pull that color back as you start to get the different layers of color to play together. It's really just a push and pull of moving around paint and water and a dry brush versus a wet brush and all that kind of stuff. And then you also want to make sure that you're very good about washing your brush between switches between warm and cool colors. So I had to really make sure I washed my brush well when I went from that dark blue and purple at the top down to the oranges at the bottom. And now it's time to jump over to that right side landscape and use the tip of my brush to start to map in some of the grass layers. This is a very long grass area on the bank, so I used just the very tip of my brush with very little water, lots of nice pigment, and I went over it with a couple different layers of color so that I could create the texture that I was seeing in the photograph. And then with those same colors, I started going up to the middle land section and sort of mapping in the more defined areas of that part of that painting as well. And then jumping back down to the bottom again, going in with a darker brown, really trying to define the grasses down there and give it the rich, warm depth of browns that I saw in the photograph. And this is where this landscape piece really started coming together when I added that other layer at the top of edge of the landscape, added that other layer at the top edge of the landscape, and then really started going with the darks to start defining that middle land section. This is when I fell in love with this thumbnail landscape. It's just, I love those browns together and the yellows and the ochres, and it's really fun. And just little touches here and there to define what is happening back there. Little, vertical things to kind of map in what I think might be some posts or fencing. I don't know. Couldn't tell in the photo, but I knew that I could allude to them and, really add some rich darks to mirror the photograph, but then also kind of help tell the story in the painting. now it was time to go back up to the top right landscape and really define that back horizon line with those mountains. I laid in my purple, I went in with blue, I added some orange. Now I'm going in with black and just really going for it. I'm going to add a little bit more to it to kind of pull it back so it's not such a stark contrast, but it really was dark in the photograph, so it doesn't bother me that I, really went for the black there. This is where I'm layering in some purple, and I'm kind of taking the black down a notch, but keeping the darkness. And then I did the same thing down below. I kind of used dark blue, dark purple, and kind of added some more depth to the flower situation that's happening on the bottom by creating some more defined areas with these brush strokes, because those sections have dried now. But it also is another value and to the area. So by going in with the dark purple and then again with the magentas, I'm getting definition in what texture and what that is in the photograph, but then also adding depth. So it really becomes this rich section in the painting, which I love. And then I still had one more rectangle to go, so I found another reference image and began sketching it out. This one, so when you use a website like Unsplash, you get a bunch of smaller, you get a whole page, a search result, right, that has a bunch of smaller images on it. I had been just painting from those, which had worked fine for the other images. For this one, I could use that to sketch in the basic shapes, but you're going to notice that it gets a little muddled when I start painting it. And then I finally think to click on the image to enlarge it so that I can really see what's happening in there. And that's when I'm able to add the really fine details that kind of help it make more sense. So ultimately, it's the sun setting with water in the background, and then there's some really dense, bright blue clouds that divide between the sky and the beach. There actually isn't any water that you see, but you can tell that it's, I don't know, I felt like there was water there. But the blue in my painting is going to end up looking like water in the center of the landscape instead of sky. So that was another situation where painting what I saw from a photograph to watercolor just didn't translate as well. But in the end, I decided to just leave it because I was really happy with what I'd done in the other areas of the painting. And it wasn't my focus for that piece, but it was something to consider. So sometimes if you're trying to recreate a reference image, you need to keep in mind that because it's not a photograph, like you're not creating the same photograph of that moment, you're using that as a reference, that some things just don't translate as well. And you need to give yourself a little grace there, because it's not that you can't do it. It's just that medium doesn't do what that photograph could capture with, in film. So I've mapped out the land, I've mapped out these plant things, and now I'm kind of putting in the sunset a little bit. Like I said, this painting has a lot of awkward stages. This is kind of where I'm also not loving there's some weird pilling that's happening with the paper. I'm not quite sure why it's happening on this sheet, but if that ever happens with your watercolor paper, you can just bear with it and then let it dry, and then you can kind of brush off those pilled up paper fibers. So just dropping in the color, trying not to bleed it into the sun because I wasn't patient enough to let that dry. I should have painted, if I'd figured out this landscape ahead of time and not just jumped into the other ones, I would have been able to jump around back and forth between them and it and had a little easier time, but it worked out fine in the end. So now that the earthy tones have dried on the lower part, I'm going to go back in with the greens and start defining these plants. It's a lot of awkward stages with these, but they were really fun to paint. So I'm just mapping in the what I see as the layers of color to get what I'm seeing in the reference images. So mapping in the greens, fading them out so that I have some definition between them, and just building it up as I go. And I went back in with some yellow ochre, and this is where things start to get a little muddled, but in the end, it all comes together. So now here's that weird blue. In the photograph, it really truly is clouds. It's like a really low-lying cloud system, but in the painting, it looks like water, and that's okay. So it turns into a beach scene. The plants are cactusy type things. In the end, the sun's setting on, the water somewhere, and it's fine. But I do wish that I had just embraced the water aspect of it and modified it so it truly looked like water and not just a band of blue going across the page. But I could always go in later. I do a little bit in there because there is some shading with the dark blue, because I'm really trying to create the storm feeling, the cloud feeling, but this part isn't super successful, and that's okay. But it is very helpful to kind of reflect back on this experience and then apply that into future paintings. So don't ever, if you have a not so successful moment in your art, use that as part, that is one step in your growth. Maybe it's a new medium, maybe it's a new subject matter, maybe it's something like this, where taking a photograph and turning it into a painting for replication purposes isn't going to work so great. That's, just happens. Totally happens. So anyway, moving back on, I'm adding in some of the darks for there. This is kind of around the time that I start to figure out that I can't really see what's happening with those enough. But I'm still, kind of in denial about it a little bit. So I'm going in and defining the ground, putting in some of those shadows, helping those plants really appear like they're growing out of the ground, popping in some more boldness in the sky now that paint has set a bit more. This was a very colorful reference image, which is probably why I liked it. Why I picked it, because I really love those bold colors. Still tackling that weird cloud thing that is becoming an ocean. But it's good. The blue behind the plants is really nice, and it gives a nice contrast to all the other warmness that's happening in the other colors. So it serves a nice purpose in the end. And adding some more value behind the plants. And then I checked my masking fluid to make sure that it was dry, and then I used my masking fluid remover thingy to gently clear off the masking fluid and to reveal the stars in the sky for that bottom left piece. I ended up circling back to this page of landscapes at a later date, and I forgot to film it. So I don't actually have the continuation of that top left landscape other than the reference image at the end, but I really am happy with how this whole page turned out, and I hope you will try some watercolor landscapes yourself. Till next time!